was like an adopted uncle. You're past Cross. You didn't have a chance to listen announce, but when you talk about guys, what do you? First of all, some stories about Ernie Harwell that you can recollect.
Well, I met him once at a National Sportscasters Sports Writers Convention, and that's where you rub shoulders with some of the very best. But I never really heard Ernie broadcast a game. He obviously the Detroit Tigers. I've lived in Florida since 1956. 1954. I was 9 years old when my parents moved to Florida. So it's tough to get Detroit radio down in the state of Florida. But I grew up a Cleveland Indians fan.
Okay.
And I listened. We could hear 3WE, a clear channel station in Cleveland, Ohio. My mother and I would keep scorecards at our home in Jacksonville, listening to 3W. And Herb Score was a broadcaster on. I don't know if you remember Herb, but left-handed pitcher that Gil McDougall hit that line drive, it ricocheted off his head, and his vision was impaired, and his baseball career was over. But he became a heck of an announcer, and we used to listen. We made up our own scorecards, and that's how I got interested in sports broadcasting, is listening to baseball play-by-play from the Cleveland Indians radio network in Ohio. And a lot of folks nowadays don't appreciate what clear channel radio stations were, but they were always 50,000 watt stations, and they were on a frequency that nobody else could have. And at nighttime, you could hear AM radio stations, clear channel. I could listen to Jack Buck do Kansas City, St. Louis Cardinals games on KMOX radio in St. Louis, another clear channel radio station. But
right.
The great days of AM radio have gone by, and now you pick up your telephone and you get the right app. You can listen to Major League broadcasts. You can listen to NFL broadcasts. You can listen to You can listen to college broadcasts on TuneIn. And but back in the day, that's how I got involved and had this desire to get into sports broadcasting just by listening to clear channel radio. People ask me, who was your favorite basketball announcer? Kaywood Ledford. Kaywood from Kentucky. Right. Because Kaywood was on two, not just one, but two 50,000 watt clear channel radios, WHAS in Louisville, right, and WLW in Cincinnati, Ohio. Right. I don't think there's another announcer that had two clear channel radio stations that he broadcast on. So I listened to Kaywood Ledford, and that's probably part of right to left on your radio dial. I mean, that was part of Kaywood's thing, and that's what I say when I broadcast football and basketball games.
At a time when a lot of these legendary broadcasters are retiring or passing on, do you feel that you have that one connection to the audiences that you have, that we're losing that sense of iconic connection with a lot of these broadcasters? It obviously life goes on, but it's still, there seems to be that thing that seems to be missing nowadays, that we're losing a lot of our icons.
Well, people were probably upset when the horse and buggy era ended. You started driving around in Model A's, or Model T's, I guess it was.
Right.
But times move on, and the next step in the broadcast business, who knows what it's going to be? Virtual reality. I mean, I can't figure out what's going to happen next, but all I know is that FSU is going to play a football game on Saturday. Tampa Bay is going to play a football game on Sunday. And hopefully, good Lord willing, the creek don't rise, and my plane arrives on time, and I broadcast the Buccaneers game in Seattle. So it's but things move on. I mean, I've been a voracious newspaper reader since I was in the 6th and 7th grade. I've been reading newspapers since then. When I was in high school, 11th and 12th grade, the teacher that I had, you were required to have something out of the newspaper that was significant or had something to do with your daily lessons, and I still subscribe to newspapers. I may be old school, but they're delivered in my driveway. I pick it up. But eventually, and Scott, you probably, I don't know if you do the same thing, but before I pick up my newspaper, I've already read most of it on my iPhone, okay?
Oh, yeah.
And so I pick up the newspaper, and it goes in the trash can. Right. But I still subscribe to the newspaper because I've been doing it since, like I say, I've been reading the paper and magazines since I was in the 6th grade.
You got to know me pretty well, so let me ask you a question. You had a unique situation where you had a London game and then you had a domestic game. How did you manage that?
Well, I got to tip my hat to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers because without their support, it would not have worked. But and also without Learfield IMG support, because I'm contractually obligated to do Florida State football games. I can miss basketball games, but not that many, and that's part of the contract. But I had to do something for Florida State, and I feel obligated because I'm a Seminole guy.
Right.
I went to Clemson, South Carolina, broadcast the first quarter, and then handed off to Tom Block, our sideline announcer, who does basketball games and has filled in for me on football case one at a time.
Right.
And then the Buccaneers then paid for me to have a driver to get me to an airport, fly on a private plane to Atlanta, fly on a plane to London, and do the broadcast, and then put me in a hotel back in Tampa after the game was over. And without that, I could have not have pulled off that London trip. That's the second time that I have been able to do this past game at Clemson, one quarter, at Florida State against Maryland 10 years ago.
Right.
I left at halftime. Tom filled in for me. I flew to London. Same deal. Small little jet plane gets me from Tallahassee to Atlanta. From Atlanta on a big plane to London. Get off the plane. Driver picks you up, drives you to the stadium.
Right.
The game at Wembley against Chicago, I got to the stadium 3 hours before kickoff. The game this season in London, Tampa Bay versus Carolina, I got to the stadium an hour and 10 minutes before kickoff. But again, thank you very much, Learfield IMG, and thank you very much, Tampa Bay Buccaneers Radio Network. Without them agreeing to do that, I would not have been able to do two games, and that holds true for the game before. And the third Bucs game, the very first one we did, somehow, some way, Florida State played a Thursday night game in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And I was able to fly on Friday to London, broadcast the game, and then come back with the team. So I've done 3 London trips, and I hope we don't play in London in the next 4 or 5 years. I hope not.
Well, I got to tell you, listening to this story kind of reminds me of, since I have a little auto racing in my blood, watching a driver do the Indianapolis 500 and the Coca-Cola 600 in one day.
Yeah, that's similar. Yeah, Scott, that would be similar.
It does, doesn't it? So, all right, obviously you have the Miami Hurricanes and the Florida State Seminoles coming up this weekend. I want to talk to you about this game, and then I want to talk to you about the Florida State rivalry. So why don't you address the immediate one, the Hurricanes against the Seminoles, and I'll give you the floor on this about your best memories. What do you think of the game, what we can look forward to over the weekend?
Well, the national championship seems to, back in the day, went through Florida State's Tallahassee, Miami Coral Gables, or Florida Gainesville. I mean, Steve Spurrier won a championship. Remember 1996? I'll never forget.
Right.
Florida State played Florida on a chilly day with a heavy wind out of the south, and the team moving toward the south end zone just couldn't move the football because the wind was a factor. You took away your passing game. And Warwick Dunn had about 140 yards, 150 yards in that ball game, and the Seminoles win by 3, 24-21. And Coach and I got driving out to do the TV show after the game, and what are you hearing, Coach, about who we're going to play for the championship of the bowl? He said, what I'm hearing, what I heard in the locker room is they're talking about we're going to have to play the Gators again, And son of a gun, that's exactly what transpired, and FSU had to play Florida in the Sugar Bowl. And remember that was the late hits, and Steve beefing about the late hits and all that stuff. And the Orange and the Sugar Bowl, the Gators prevailed. We had half the team came down with the flu. Warwick Dunn could not play in that ball game, and Florida won the championship. That was Steve's only championship. Steve never beat Florida State at Tallahassee. He never did. There was one chance in 1994, and had a 28-point lead going to the fourth quarter, and FSU somehow, some way, when Rock Preston scored a touchdown and we got the point after touchdown to tie the game at 31-all. That's the famous choke and doke, but I digress. And then Miami, didn't matter whether it was Jimmy Johnson or Dennis Erickson or Larry Coker, they figured out a way to beat us and win national championships. But, as I mentioned a little earlier, 8 national titles between Florida State and Miami, and add the 3 that, Steve won 1, and then Urban Meyer won 2. So they have 3, Florida State has 3, and Miami has 5. That's a lot of national championships for the Sunshine State.
Are you amazed, though, that a lot of schools around the country are coming to the Sunshine State to recruit the talent that you have? Because I think the state of Florida has so much talent that you can, who knows how many programs you could funnel with the amount of talent that you have here. I'm just amazed because even my home state schools, the Michigan Wolverines come down here to get a lot of talent. Michigan State comes down here. And I'm sure the list goes on, Gene, but you talk about the high school football in Florida. It's just remarkable, isn't it?
Well, you asked me just a moment ago about some of the great memories. Well, you mentioned Michigan.
Yeah.
Florida State played Michigan twice up there, and then we played them in the Orange Bowl here a couple of years ago, beating Jim Harbaugh.
Right.
But one of my favorite memories, and in fact it should be, it's not one of my top 10 plays, but it should be. There were two plays when Florida State went up and just absolutely annihilated the Michigan Wolverines in the Big House.
Right.
106,000 fans watching an FSU. But we had a defensive tackle pick off a pass and return it for a touchdown. We had a trick play, a fake field goal for a touchdown in that ball game. Terrell Buckley just shut down Desmond Howard, and that was one of the more memorable Florida State wins over the Michigan Wolverines up there. It was it's like 1981. FSU goes to Notre Dame. We were the first team to make our first appearance at Notre Dame Stadium and come away with a win. 1981. Those are tremendous victories for Florida State University, and the list goes on and on. I have great the win over Clemson. Clemson was ranked number 3 in 1988. The punt Ruski set up the winning field goal at the end. Just tremendous games, and then every game in the Florida State Miami rivalry where Florida State prevailed. Those are significant games in my resume as broadcasting Florida State football games. It's just it doesn't get any better than rivalry football. And you're right. When I do NFL depth charts, and I prepare those myself, I don't hire some guys hire the people who do them for them. I just feel like you need to prepare and do the homework. But there are 4 states, Scott, that stand out when you do your depth charts about great players of the National Football League, and the 4 states that produce the most talent. Florida is one, Texas is another, California is the third, and that dadgum state of Georgia. My goodness, they turn out an awful lot of good football players. Those are the 4 states that you see almost every, and throw New Jersey in there maybe as a distant 5th, but Florida, Texas, California, and Georgia produce an awful lot of really, really good football players.
Yeah, and yet a sidebar to what you're saying is Florida takes on Georgia another day for another time, but you had that game over the weekend. A couple more questions here, Gene. First of all, okay, when you look at the media the way it is now, it used to be terrestrial radio. Are you amazed at internet radio, the podcasting industry, how that's taken over this industry compared to what it was like when we were doing this many years ago?
Well, podcasting has taken over the industry. I've done a number of interviews with quote unquote podcasts, not broadcast interviews, and I happened to be in Orlando on a Willie Taggart tour stop this previous spring, and the fella came up to me and said, "Hey, I heard you today in the interview, and you're talking about so." I said, "Really? Was that on the radio?" He said, "No." He said, "Well, the podcast." He said, "I listen to podcasts." He said, I listen to this podcast every day I go to work. And it just dawned on me then how powerful this new podcast generation is. All of a sudden, you don't have to have a 250 or 300-foot tower behind your broadcast transmitter. You can do podcasts and do it over online. It's sort of like, you got the Twitters, and I've got a Twitter. I don't do a lot of Instagram. I do have an Instagram account, but I just primarily do Twitter because, brevity is the soul of wit. That's what Shakespeare said, and that's what Twitter does. But this is I get all kinds of information off the Twitterverse, and I follow I follow obviously my favorite teams, but this is a whole new generation. It's like I said, horse and buggy went away. Those guys, those pooper scoopers went out of business. They had no job after those horses stopped running down Broadway and Madison Avenue in New York City. The automobile was the new thing, and now all of a sudden in our industry, podcasts are big, streaming audio is big, streaming video is good. It's big. It's a whole new ballgame.
All right, 2 other things. First of all, what do you want people to know about Gene Deckerhoff? How do you want your legacy to be defined throughout, just in general, in terms of your broadcasting career, what you want to be remembered for?
Well, today, let me see. A couple of things.